Jackson Rawls sat in the dimly lit cantina, the holographic contract flickering in front of him. His scarred fingers traced the outline of the target's face, the cold blue light reflecting off his battle-worn armor. It was a face unlike any other bounty he'd ever taken. A woman, regal and fierce. Princess Alara of Theron. Theron was a planet on the outskirts of the known galaxy, home to the Amazonian-like race of tall, powerful warriors. The princess was said to be one of their finest. Her crime, according to the client, was rebellion. Her people had fallen from power, and now she was in hiding. There was no reason given for her exile, but Jackson didn't care. He never asked why, only how much. The payout was significant, enough to buy him a quiet life far away from the battles he'd fought for years. The plan was simple: track her down, deliver her to the client, and disappear. But something nagged at him. Maybe it was the fierceness in her eyes captured in the hologram, or maybe it was the fact that he'd heard the name Alara whispered across the galaxy with respect, not fear. The truth didn't matter. She was a job, and he was a killer. With a deep breath, he closed the hologram, stood up, and prepared for the hunt. Jackson's ship, the Razorwind, hummed to life as he left the planet behind, setting course for the remote outpost where Alara was rumored to be hiding. He told himself this was just another mission, but a part of him, buried deep, knew this time was different. The outpost was desolate, a forgotten relic on the edge of the galaxy. Jackson moved silently through the abandoned corridors, his senses heightened. His intel had led him to this place, where Princess Alara had been hiding for weeks, evading mercenaries who were less skilled and less patient than he was. He found her deep within the station, in an old control room filled with the static hum of malfunctioning technology. She was standing alone, looking out a cracked viewport into the vastness of space, her back to him. Even from this distance, he could feel the strength radiating from her, a warrior's grace, honed through years of battle. Her posture was straight, her tall frame cloaked in a simple but elegant robe, hiding the scars of her past. Without a word, Jackson raised his blaster and aimed at her. His instincts told him to shoot, to finish the job quickly, as he always did. But something stopped him. Alara turned, her piercing eyes locking onto his. She didn't flinch or reach for a weapon. Instead, she stood there, tall and unyielding, staring him down with a calmness that unsettled him. There was no fear in her gaze, only defiance. She knew who he was, and she knew why he was there. "So the mercenaries have finally sent someone worthy," she said, her voice steady. "I've been waiting." Her words caught him off guard. She was expecting death, expecting him to pull the trigger and end her life. But instead of pleading or fighting, she accepted it with honor. There was something in the way she spoke that made Jackson hesitate. It was the first time in his career that he felt uncertain. "What's stopping you, mercenary?" she asked, stepping closer, her eyes locked on his. "Do it. I know why you're here." Jackson's grip tightened on his weapon. He'd never been questioned like this, never had someone stare down death so calmly. He'd killed dozens, maybe hundreds, but no one had ever looked at him the way she did. Something in him shifted. "I don't kill without understanding why," he muttered, surprising even himself with the words. Alara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Then perhaps you should know the truth before you pull that trigger." Jackson lowered his blaster ever so slightly. The mission had taken an unexpected turn, and against his better judgment, he wanted to hear what she had to say. The silence between them hung thick in the air, broken only by the low hum of the malfunctioning machinery surrounding them. Jackson's blaster remained raised, but there was no tension in his grip anymore. He studied Alara's face, the defiance, the calm. She was not at all what he had expected. He had been hired to kill a supposed rebel, a traitor to her people, but this woman standing before him was composed, noble. It didn't match the profile. "What truth?" Jackson finally asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "The contract says you led a rebellion against your people, caused a war." Alara scoffed, her gaze flickering with anger. "Is that what they told you?" She took a slow step toward him, her hands still at her sides, showing no fear despite the blaster aimed at her chest. "They lied to you, mercenary. My people were betrayed by those who wanted power for themselves. I was framed. They want me dead because I know the truth, not because of any so-called rebellion." Jackson felt a flicker of doubt. It wasn't the first time a bounty had tried to talk their way out of execution, but there was something different in Alara's voice, an honesty, an unshakable conviction. "If you're innocent, why not fight them?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "You're a warrior. You could have rallied your people." Alara's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "I did fight, but when the council turned against me, I lost everything. My warriors, my allies, even my family." Her eyes darkened, the pain of betrayal clear. "I was forced into exile, hunted by the very people I swore to protect. They branded me a traitor, and now they send you to finish the job." The more she spoke, the more Jackson's resolve wavered. Her story rang with truth, and the fire in her eyes told him she wasn't the type to surrender without reason. She had been wronged, hunted, and now she stood before him, not pleading for her life, but demanding he understand. Still, his mission was clear: capture or kill the target. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, the final question that stood between him and pulling the trigger. "Because I haven't tried to kill you," she said simply. "If I were the rebel they claimed, you'd already be dead." It was true. He had expected resistance, a fight, maybe even an ambush. But Alara had been alone, unarmed, and ready to face him without fear. Jackson lowered his blaster slightly, though he kept his finger hovering near the trigger. "I'll listen," he said after a long pause, "but I'm not making promises." Alara nodded, recognizing the small victory. She could feel the shift in him. Something had changed, and it wasn't just her words. Something deeper. Perhaps it was the same shift she had felt when their eyes first met. She could see in his gaze that he wasn't just a killer. There was something more. Hours passed as Alara and Jackson sat in the cold, broken-down control room. The flickering lights cast long shadows on the walls as she told him everything: the coup, the betrayal, and how she had been framed for a war she never started. Jackson listened intently, his usual sharp focus on the mission blurred by the growing sense that he had walked into something far more complicated than a simple contract. "So they sent you here, alone," Jackson said, piecing together the final details of her story. "Exiled with a bounty on your head. They thought you'd die out here, if not by my hand, then by some other mercenaries." Alara nodded, her eyes hardening as she relived the pain of her exile. "They knew it would be a death sentence. The council saw me as a threat, someone who could still rally support if I survived long enough. They wanted to make sure I wouldn't get that chance." Jackson leaned back against the wall, his blaster now fully lowered, though still in hand. He'd been on dozens of missions, fought through more battles than he cared to remember, but something about this one didn't sit right with him. He had been hired to kill a rebel, but what he saw now was a warrior betrayed, someone fighting to reclaim her honor. Alara turned her gaze to him, her voice softer now. "And you, mercenary, what do you fight for? Credits? Glory?" Jackson's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to answering questions. His life as a hired gun was built on one principle: get the job done. No questions asked. But now, sitting here with a woman who should have been his enemy, he found himself at a loss for words. "I fight to survive," he finally said, his voice low. "Same as you." Alara studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then she nodded. "We're more alike than you think, Jackson Rawl." Her use of his name caught him off guard. Few people called him by name, and even fewer dared to do so with such familiarity. It struck him that she had known who he was the entire time. This wasn't just a random encounter for her either. "I don't kill without reason," Jackson said, his eyes meeting hers again. "I need to know if what you're saying is true." "Then stay," Alara replied, her tone steady. "Help me get back to my people. I need someone like you, a fighter who knows how to win. Help me take back my throne, and I'll prove everything I've said." Jackson should have walked away. The mission was to kill her, not join her rebellion. But something inside him, a voice he hadn't heard in years, told him to stay. Maybe it was her courage, or the fire in her eyes, or maybe it was the way she spoke to him, not as a killer, but as an equal. Against his better judgment, Jackson holstered his blaster. "You get one chance," he said, his voice firm. "But if you're lying to me—" "I'm not," she interrupted, her voice unwavering. "I never was." For the first time in years, Jackson felt something unfamiliar, a sense of purpose beyond the next paycheck. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he knew that this mission, this woman, was going to change everything. The mercenary and the exiled princess had struck an uneasy truce. And for the first time, Jackson wasn't looking for a way out. Jackson and Alara's alliance was fragile, held together by a shared purpose and the unspoken understanding that trust was earned, not given. In the days that followed, they worked tirelessly to prepare for what was to come. Alara needed to reclaim her throne, but she also needed to be stronger, stronger than when she had been betrayed, stronger than those who sought to kill her. Jackson, ever the seasoned warrior, took it upon himself to train her. They found an isolated area near the outpost, a barren stretch of land where they wouldn't be disturbed. Every morning, under the harsh light of the alien sun, Jackson pushed Alara to her limits. "Your form is off," Jackson said as he watched her swing a makeshift blade. "Her movements fluid, but not fast enough. You're strong, but you're not thinking like a killer. Out there, hesitation will get you killed." Alara wiped the sweat from her brow, her breath coming in hard. "I wasn't raised to kill mercilessly like you were," she shot back, her frustration flaring. "I'm a warrior, not an executioner." Jackson smirked, stepping forward. "A warrior can still die if they don't strike fast enough, again." Alara gritted her teeth and swung again, this time faster, her blade meeting Jackson's with a sharp clang. He deflected her attack with ease, spinning around to deliver a mock strike to her side. She barely dodged it, her frustration growing with each near miss. "Good," Jackson muttered. "Again." For hours they sparred, their bodies moving in tandem, a dance of blades and grit. Alara's movements became sharper, her strikes more precise. Jackson could see the change in her. Each day she grew more focused, more determined. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was preparing to reclaim her throne, to confront the enemies who had taken everything from her. After their sessions, when the exhaustion set in and the alien sun dipped below the horizon, they would sit side by side in the quiet of the outpost. The weight of their pasts hung between them, unspoken but ever present. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Jackson glanced at her, noting the determination still burning in her eyes. "You've come a long way," he said, his tone gruff but sincere. Alara met his gaze, a flicker of a smile crossing her lips. "I had a good teacher." In that moment, something passed between them, a bond forged not just from necessity, but from a growing respect. They were no longer just a mercenary and an exiled princess. They were partners, united by the battles they had yet to fight. The tranquility of their training days was shattered when the outpost was ambushed. Jackson had sensed something was wrong, a prickle at the back of his neck, a shadow in the corner of his vision. But before he could warn Alara, the first explosion ripped through the silence. "Down!" Jackson barked, grabbing Alara and pulling her behind the cover of a crumbling wall just as another blast rocked the ground beneath them. Dust and debris filled the air as armed mercenaries stormed the outpost, hired guns from the same faction that had placed the bounty on Alara's head. Jackson's instincts kicked in immediately. He drew his blaster and fired, taking out two of the mercenaries with precise shots. But there were more, too many. They had come prepared, knowing full well who their target was. "Alara!" Jackson shouted over the chaos. "Get to the control room. There's an armory there. I'll cover you." Alara nodded, her eyes fierce with determination. She had trained for this, prepared for the moment she would fight for her life. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the control room, dodging blaster fire as Jackson laid down covering shots. Jackson moved like a shadow, his years of combat experience making him lethal and efficient. But as more mercenaries poured into the outpost, he knew they were outnumbered. He couldn't take them all on alone. In the control room, Alara found the armory, a stash of weapons and armor left behind by previous inhabitants. She quickly strapped on a set of armor, grabbed a plasma rifle, and took a deep breath. This was it. Her moment to prove that she wasn't just a princess in exile, she was a warrior. Bursting back into the fray, Alara joined Jackson, her rifle blazing. Together, they moved in perfect sync, covering each other's flanks, taking out enemies with ruthless precision. The mercenaries had expected an easy target, a scared woman on the run. What they found instead was a deadly duo, fighting with the skill and determination of seasoned warriors. As the battle raged on, Alara found herself back-to-back with Jackson, their movements fluid, their connection unspoken but undeniable. For every mercenary that charged at them, They had a counter, Jackson's brutal efficiency paired with Alara's newfound strength. But even as they fought, the sheer number of enemies began to overwhelm them. Jackson knew they couldn't keep this up forever. A surge of panic rose in his chest, panic not for himself but for Alara. He hadn't expected to care this much, hadn't expected to feel this protective. "Alara, we need to move," Jackson shouted, blasting another mercenary down as they advanced. "We can't hold them off here." But before they could retreat, a massive explosion rocked the entire outpost. The force of the blast sent Jackson and Alara flying, slamming into the ground. Jackson's vision blurred as he struggled to push himself up, his ears ringing. Through the haze, he saw Alara struggling to her feet, her face smeared with dirt and blood, but her eyes still blazing with defiance. "Jackson," she shouted, her voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. "We have to finish this." Jackson, despite the pain coursing through his body, found himself grinning. She was every bit the warrior she had claimed to be, and more. "Let's end it," he growled, pushing himself to his feet. With renewed resolve, they charged into the fray one last time, side by side. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was a battle for their future, for their lives, and for each other. In the chaos of the fight, Jackson realized something profound. He wasn't just fighting to protect her because it was his mission. He was fighting because somewhere along the way, in the heat of battle and through the fire of trust, he had come to care for her. And in the heart of that realization, Jackson knew. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was the beginning of something much deeper. The aftermath of the ambush left the outpost in ruins. The once desolate hideout was now littered with debris, broken walls, and the smoldering remnants of battle. Jackson and Alara stood among the wreckage, breathing heavily, bruised and bloodied, but alive. The last of the mercenaries lay defeated at their feet, but the toll of the fight weighed heavily on both of them. Jackson's eyes followed Alara as she inspected the bodies, collecting weapons and supplies. He had never seen someone fight with such raw passion and determination. She was a force to be reckoned with, a warrior in every sense. But beneath the armor and fire, Jackson saw something else, something he had tried to ignore for days now. He cared about her, more than he had allowed himself to admit. As Alara finished her task, she turned to Jackson, wiping blood from her cheek. "We need to move. There will be more. They'll send another wave." Jackson nodded, but he couldn't shake the knot tightening in his chest. He had been in dangerous situations before. He had faced death more times than he could count. But this was different. The thought of losing her sent a chill through him, something deeper than the adrenaline of battle or the instinct to survive. "Alara," Jackson said, his voice low, unsteady. She looked at him, sensing the change in his tone. "What is it?" For a moment, Jackson was silent, unsure how to express what had been building inside him. He was a killer, a mercenary. His life had been built on violence and survival. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. But standing here, looking at her, Jackson knew he couldn't deny it any longer. "I've killed a lot of people," he began, his voice rough. "I've done things I'm not proud of, but when I was hired to come after you, I never expected this." He paused, meeting her gaze, his chest tight with vulnerability. "I never expected to care." Alara's expression softened, her eyes searching his, as if she was trying to understand the weight behind his words. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, the gesture soft, grounding. "Jackson, I'm not supposed to care," he continued, shaking his head, struggling to find the right words. "I'm not supposed to feel anything. I was hired to kill you, Alara, but now I'd die to protect you." The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. Jackson felt exposed in a way he hadn't in years, his heart laid bare for the first time since he could remember. Alara's grip on his arm tightened slightly, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she took a step closer, her face inches from his. "You're not the only one who wasn't expecting this," she said quietly, her voice filled with a rare vulnerability. "You were supposed to be my enemy, Jackson, the mercenary sent to end my life." Her hand moved to his chest, resting over his heart. "But you didn't. You fought beside me, and somewhere along the way, you became more than just a mercenary." Jackson's breath caught as he felt the warmth of her hand against his chest, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent his entire life avoiding attachments, avoiding anything that might slow him down. But with Alara, He couldn't help it. She wasn't just another contract. She was the first person in a long time who had seen him for more than his reputation. "Alara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Before he could say another word, she leaned in and kissed him. Softly, hesitantly at first, then with more certainty. It wasn't a kiss born out of passion alone, but one filled with all the unspoken words and feelings that had grown between them during their time together. A kiss that acknowledged the battles they had fought and the bond they had forged. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers, his heart pounding. "What do we do now?" Alara smiled, the fire in her eyes softened by the tenderness between them. "We fight," she whispered. "Together." The weight of their confession lingered in the air, but it did not deter them from the reality of their situation. They had to move quickly if they were to survive. The mercenaries who had come for Alara were just the first wave. More would follow, and next time, they wouldn't stop until both she and Jackson were dead. As they prepared to leave the outpost, Jackson's mind raced with strategy. "We can't just run," he said, his voice back to its usual sharpness. "They'll find us no matter where we go. We need to hit them first." Alara nodded, strapping on the last of her armor. "Agreed. We need to be the ones in control. If we stay on the defensive, we'll lose. I know who sent them. They're after me, because they fear what I represent. If I make it back to Theron, they lose their grip on the council." Jackson's brow furrowed as he considered the risk. "We need a way to strike at them without putting ourselves in the open." Alara looked thoughtful for a moment, then her eyes lit up with an idea. "There's a hidden network of loyalists on Theron who've been waiting for my return. If we can get a message to them, they'll rally to our side. But we need to disrupt the mercenary communications first, or they'll track our every move." Jackson's lips curled into a grin. "Now you're thinking like a killer." Alara smirked in return. "I've learned from the best." They worked quickly, laying out a plan to disable the mercenaries' comms network and send a message to Alara's allies. The nearest communications hub was on the outskirts of Theron's capital, heavily guarded but essential to their enemies' operations. If they could take it down, it would give them the upper hand and buy them time to regroup. "Once we disable the hub, we'll need to move fast," Jackson warned. "They'll know something's wrong, and it won't take long for them to retaliate." Alara nodded. "I can handle it. I've spent my life preparing for this fight, Jackson. With you at my side, we can win." There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt. Jackson admired her resilience, her strength. She had lost everything, been betrayed by her own people. Yet here she stood, unbroken, ready to reclaim what was hers. As they left the outpost and made their way toward Theron, Jackson couldn't help but steal glances at her. She moved with purpose, her determination palpable. And as much as he tried to focus on the mission, his thoughts kept drifting back to the kiss they had shared, the confession that had changed everything. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for each other. Night fell as they approached the outskirts of the capital. The comms hub loomed ahead, its lights casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. Jackson and Alara crouched behind a ridge, surveying the heavily guarded facility. "Are you ready?" Jackson asked, his voice low. Alara glanced at him, her eyes steady and fierce. "I've been ready for this my entire life." Jackson's heart swelled, with a mixture of pride and something deeper. He had come to this planet as a killer, but now he was something more. He was fighting not just for a mission, but for a future, one he had never thought possible. Together, they would take back her throne. Together, they would face whatever came next. And in that moment, Jackson knew there was nothing he wouldn't do to protect her. The night sky over Theron's capital was filled with the hum of activity as Jackson and Alara crept closer to the communications hub. The plan was simple. Infiltrate, disable the network, and send out a coded message to Alara's loyalists. But simplicity didn't make it any less dangerous. The facility was crawling with mercenaries, all of them armed to the teeth, waiting for any sign of rebellion. Jackson's sharp eyes scanned the perimeter, counting the guards and mapping out their patrols. He and Alara had done this sort of thing before, but this time, everything was at stake. If they were caught, it wouldn't just mean their deaths. It would mean the end of Alara's fight to reclaim her throne. He glanced at her, catching the determined look on her face as she readied herself for the task ahead. She was dressed in battle armor, her tall frame and warrior's poise making her look every inch the Amazonian princess she was. But beneath the armor, Jackson knew, was someone who had captured his heart in ways he hadn't thought possible. "You know the plan," he said, his voice low. "I'll take out the guards on the west side and create a diversion. You disable the system and send out the signal. We meet back at the ridge." Alara nodded, her expression unreadable, but Jackson could see the fire burning behind her eyes. "I'll see you there." Without another word, they split up, moving silently through the shadows. Jackson slipped behind enemy lines, his blaster in hand, taking out 2 guards with quiet efficiency. His movements were swift, calculated, like a predator in his element. Each step brought him closer to the main entrance, where he could create enough chaos to distract the guards long enough for Alara to finish her mission. Inside the hub, Alara moved with the same precision. The facility was vast, filled with rows of terminals and screens flashing encrypted communications. She found the main control panel and began her work, fingers flying across the interface as she bypassed security protocols and prepared the message that would rally her loyalists. The moment of truth was approaching, but her thoughts strayed to Jackson. He had become more than just a protector to her. He was her partner, the one person who had never doubted her, even when the rest of the galaxy turned against her. She knew that whatever happened tonight, they were in this together. Suddenly, an alarm blared, jolting her out of her thoughts. The diversion had begun. Outside, explosions rocked the facility as Jackson unleashed hell on the guards, drawing them away from Alara's position. She didn't have much time. "Alara," Jackson's voice came through her earpiece, rough and urgent. "They've got more reinforcements than we thought. I can hold them off, but you need to move faster." "I'm almost done," she replied, her fingers moving with even greater speed. Outside, Jackson was in the thick of it. The guards had regrouped, and blaster fire lit up the night as they closed in on his position. Jackson fought back with everything he had, his movements a blur of violence and precision, but there were too many of them. His heart pounded as he realized he might not make it back to Alara in time. "Alara," he called, the urgency in his voice rising. "Get out of there." But Alara wasn't leaving without sending the signal. She couldn't. Her entire future, her people's future, depended on it. With one final keystroke, the message was sent. "It's done," she shouted, pulling away from the terminal, just as a group of mercenaries burst into the room. Without hesitation, she drew her plasma rifle and fired, cutting them down before they could reach her. She sprinted for the exit, her heart hammering in her chest. The facility was in chaos, smoke and fire filling the air as more mercenaries poured in. She could see Jackson in the distance, fighting off a wave of attackers, his face twisted in grim determination. But then, as she reached the ridge, she saw him fall. A sharp cry escaped her lips as she watched Jackson collapse to the ground, hit by a barrage of blaster fire. Panic gripped her as she raced toward him, her mind racing with fear. She had come so close to winning, so close to being free. And now, she was about to lose the one person who had fought beside her. "Alara, no," Jackson gasped as she reached him, his voice strained with pain. "You have to go. Finish it." But she wasn't leaving him behind. Not now. Not ever. "I'm not going anywhere," she said fiercely, pulling him up despite the protests of his injuries. "We're getting out of this together." With the last of their strength, they fought their way through the mercenaries, side by side, until they reached the extraction point. The signal had been sent, and Alara's loyalists were on their way. But now the only thing that mattered was getting Jackson to safety. The battle for Theron was over, but the real war was just beginning. Days later, Jackson awoke in a medical bay, his body aching but alive. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was Alara, sitting by his bedside, her expression filled with relief. "You're awake," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "You scared me for a moment there." Jackson blinked, still disoriented, but the sight of her, alive and unhurt, was all he needed to know that they had made it. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We won," Alara replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "My loyalists responded to the signal. They've already begun to take back the capital. The council is in retreat. It's over." Jackson let out a long breath, the weight of the battle lifting from his shoulders. But even as relief washed over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Their bond had been forged in the heat of battle, but now, in the quiet of victory, it felt even stronger. Alara squeezed his hand, her gaze softening. "I couldn't have done this without you," she whispered. "You saved me, Jackson, more than once." "You saved me too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "In more ways than you know." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. But now, instead of fear or uncertainty, there was only hope. Hope for a future they had fought so hard to win. As the days passed, Alara's power grew. Her loyalists had rallied to her cause, and the remnants of the council were being driven from power. Theron was hers once again, and the future looked brighter than it had in years. But even as she ascended to her rightful place as queen, Alara made one thing clear: she wasn't ruling alone. Jackson stood beside her as she reclaimed her throne, his presence a quiet strength at her side. The galaxy had known him as a killer, a mercenary without loyalty or heart. But now, standing beside the woman he had come to love, he had found something more, something worth fighting for. Together, they looked out over the gathered crowd, the weight of their journey heavy on their shoulders, but the promise of a new beginning filling the air. Alara turned to him, her hand slipping into his. "We've come a long way." Jackson nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "And we're just getting started." With the galaxy watching and a future full of promise ahead, Jackson and Alara faced their new path together. No longer mercenary and princess, but partners, bound by love and forged in battle. And whatever came next, they would face it side by side.